welcome to Dynamic Earth. The last time I addressed conference in person feels like such a long time ago. It's great to see you all again. So much has happened since 2019, since the last time we were together as a party. The world has changed. The pandemic turned everything upside down, and we've seen great loss, economic hardship and isolation. At the same time, we've seen more and more extreme weather events around the world and here in Scotland, reminding us that climate breakdown is here. But conference, we are also here, after a record election result which saw us grow our vote in every part of Scotland. The Scottish Greens can offer hope like we never have before. On a personal level, when I last spoke to you, I wouldn't have dreamed that the next time I did, I would be standing here as the first ever Scottish Green MSP to represent Central Scotland. And I bet you all didn't believe I'd get up here without tripping. I am wearing boots, I didn't wear heels, it was deliberate. The very wonderful John Finney has retired since we were last together, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank John for all his work and personally for his support, and hope that retirement is treating him well. Our new MSP team have been working so hard since we've been elected, passing emergency legislation, getting to grips with committees, regional work, speaking to branches, contributing to debates, asking questions of government, and so much more. And of course, this is our first conference as a party of government. It's only been a month since Patrick and Lorna became ministers, and I know they've been working extremely hard behind the scenes to further our priorities. This week, the Tories asked Patrick why his zero-carbon building strategy had taken so long. It's nice to know that they have such high expectations of us. The Tories are floundering, sniping from the sidelines and trying to get Parliament to back the Campbell oil field. That went well. But as we face the climate and nature emergencies, impatience is a virtue. The United Nations are coming to Glasgow next month, and the pressure is on world leaders to act. But while Boris Johnson bumbles jokes about Kermit the Frog while licensing new oil fields, it'll be up to climate justice activists to apply the real pressure. I met climate strikers in East Kilbride at the last global climate strike. They were absolutely clear about what is needed from world leaders. They need immediate, just and concrete action to prevent further climate breakdown. Conference, thanks to our members and activists, the Scottish Greens are in a position to do that in a way we never have before. Our councillors are leading the way in local authorities, our MSPs are representing their communities fiercely in Parliament and in government. We have 2 ministers, the first Green ministers in UK history. So please give a warm welcome to those 2 ministers, our co-leaders, Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvie.
Good morning. It is so lovely to see you all. So a bit of stuff has happened since we met in 2019, when we were all last together in person. In the face of the global pandemic, with millions dead around the world, it might seem difficult to properly celebrate our political successes. But political successes they are, and historic ones at that, with lasting positive consequences for Scotland and hopefully for the world. This May, our record election results saw us grow our vote in every part of Scotland, and now we have Greens in government for the first time ever. Yeah. It is the first time that Green politicians have been in government anywhere in the UK. Being in government is a chance for us to live our values, to show what we are capable of, and to lead the change that Scotland so badly needs. These are your successes. They happened because of every leaflet you delivered, every call you made, and every conversation that you had with friends, neighbors, and families, every campaign meeting that you attended. Other parties have millionaire backers, but we have you, and you gave so generously of your time and money where you could afford them. Please accept my heartfelt thank you to each of you. I also want to thank the people who are no longer with us, but who built this party up bit by bit over the last 30 years. They did so with the hope that one day we would be in a position where we could be in government and to be able to turn our words into actions and our vision for Scotland into a reality. What a journey it has been. It is 22 years since Robin Harper was elected as the first Green parliamentarian anywhere in the UK. Thank you, Robin. You worked day and night for our party and for our movement, and you showed the difference that Greens can make. That is the work that we have been building on ever since. Patrick and I and our parliamentary colleagues understand the scale of expectations and the weight of responsibility that we need to live up to. The cooperation agreement that we negotiated and that you approved is a historic opportunity, and one that will benefit our party, our country, and our environment. Many of the policies that you wrote, you voted for, and that you put into our manifesto are now being made into law. As we meet this weekend, we can do so with more than just hope. We can do so with the knowledge that the policies we discuss can change the lives of people across our country. We are proud of our record in opposition. In the last term alone, Green MSPs secured progressive taxation, a pay rise for the public sector workers, hundreds of millions of pounds for local authorities, free school meals for all primary-aged children, and free bus travel for everyone under 22. And now we are taking it further. We are putting climate justice and social justice at the heart of government. I'm incredibly proud that as a result of this agreement, we will see record investment in renewable energy and green technology. We will invest in the future and create thousands of new jobs by doubling Scotland's onshore wind capacity, as well as making Scotland a leader in marine energy. We will invest in our seas, creating no-take zones where wildlife and fisheries can thrive. We will promote green skills and do it in a way that puts people first and supports our communities, with a £500 million Just Transition Fund to ensure that Murray and the North East can become thriving hubs of innovation and turbocharge our green economy. We will invest in biodiversity with new protections for our wildlife and new investment into restoring Scotland's natural wildlife. And we will designate Scotland's first new national park in 20 years. We will introduce a new deal for tenants. We will invest in young people by introducing at least 3,500 new teachers and 500 classroom assistants. We will introduce a new and locally nuanced national care service with better wages and conditions for the carers who have done so much for all of us. In fact, this week we took an important step toward rewarding carers for the vital work that they do, increasing the minimum pay for those on the real living wage in adult social care by 5%. We will put equality at the heart of government and finally bring in the GRA reforms which have taken so long. We will end so-called conversion therapy and stand shoulder to shoulder and side by side with all of our LGBTQ+ community siblings who have been targeted with one of the most cynical hate campaigns I have ever seen from large parts of our national media and far too many of our politicians. These are the changes that can only happen with Greens in government. They are changes that will make a difference to people's lives, and they are changes we are very proud to be delivering. The timing could not be more urgent. All across the world, we are seeing climate breakdown and extreme weather events. The UN has warned that it is code red for our climate. We have no time to waste. And what is Boris Johnson doing about it? He has appointed a trade secretary who believes that climate change is a hoax. He has said that the world needs to grow up to tackle the threat, but he is supporting new oil fields. We cannot go on like this. We cannot trust the anti-climate Tories, not while they are working hand in hand with polluters, while inflicting a cost of living crisis on our communities. The last 18 months have been some of the hardest for many of us, and the Tory solution is to cut universal credit at the same time as they are pulling support from people unable to work due to the pandemic that they have mishandled so badly. This is not the recovery. Only last week they appointed one of their donors as a Scottish minister. These are not the actions of a government that is interested in our communities. They are the actions of a government that has contempt for democracy. Indeed, they use the courts to stop the Scottish Parliament enshrining the rights of children. These are the actions of a government that knows the price of some things, but the value of nothing. They are the actions of a tired and discredited Westminster party that is concerned with its donors and its cronies, and not with the people that it is meant to represent. Very soon, the eyes of the world will be on Scotland for COP26. But what will they see? The Prime Minister has said that he does not want the Scottish Government to be involved in case they use it as an advert for independence. Every day that Boris Johnson and his colleagues stand in Downing Street is an advert for Scottish independence. We do not have time to wait for Westminster to figure things out and get it right, because they won't. We can do so much better than this. That is why we will deliver a referendum on Scottish independence in this parliamentary term. With the full powers of independence, we can take a different path. We can build a better society. We can build our circular economy and invest in people. We can be a European leader in renewable energy. We can build a Scotland that works with our friends and neighbours, a Scotland that stands in solidarity with people living under oppression, and a Scotland that welcomes refugees and extends the hand of friendship around the world. It won't always be easy. There will be difficult moments, but there always is when history is being made. My colleagues and I didn't stand for Parliament because it would be easy. We did it because we believe in our vision and in our party. We believe that things can be so much better. There is nothing inevitable about poverty. There's nothing inevitable about austerity. There is nothing inevitable about climate breakdown. When I think about our party, when I think about our movement, when I think about the young people from around the world crying out for change, that is when I know things can get better. All across the world, we are seeing Greens making a difference, whether it is in New Zealand, where the Green politicians are helping to build a well-being economy, or in Germany, where they have just achieved a record result. We are a global movement, but one that is rooted in our communities. There is an old saying in our movement that I know you all know well, that we should think globally but act locally. And that is what our branches are doing all across the country. It is our branches, our activists, and our councillors that are the bedrock of our party. Every one of us in this hall started the same way. We may have been motivated by different things, but we all joined as members and got involved. Next year, we will see local elections across Scotland. We have the chance to win a record number of councillors, to expand the work that is already being done by Greens in town halls across the country. Green councillors make a real difference, whether by sticking up for public services and active travel or representing residents. That is why it is vital that we get as many councillors as possible elected and that we continue to grow our party and our movement. When Robin was first elected, our membership was only a few hundred. Now it is over 7,000 and growing. I believe that we are just getting started. There are big things ahead for us. Conference, it has been a long journey for us to get this far. It has taken the work of generations of activists brought together by a desire to do things differently. But it is also just the beginning of our journey as a party of government, working and delivering for Scotland and our planet day in and day out. Thank you. Thank you so much. And if your hands aren't too sore, please welcome Patrick Harvie.
Thanks very much, Lorna. And it is genuinely lovely to be back with you all again. I say all. I know not everybody's here in the hall. There are many, many more who are watching online in this hybrid format. But whether you're here today at Dynamic Earth or watching online, it is genuinely a delight to be back together again, back with you all. Lorna's speech reflected on our past as well as looking forward and talking about the journey that we've all been on together. I guess I've been thinking about that quite a lot recently as well. My journey started when I was taken along to Green Party branch meetings as a child, back when my mum was an activist and a candidate. If my favourite time traveller bundled me off into the TARDIS and took me back to those days, would my younger self have believed that I'd be one of the first Green ministers in this country, taking on the responsibility to invest billions of pounds in making our transport and energy systems greener? I just don't know. Or maybe the TARDIS would have dropped me off back in the 90s when I first moved to Glasgow. I had a low-paid temping job and a landlord who wouldn't give me a contract. That ended with him turning up with a bunch of guys to start removing furniture and fixtures and fittings from the flat and turfing me out. And sadly, today, landlords like that do still exist. I'd love to go back in time and tell my younger self, Patrick, one day you'll be the Minister for Tenants' Rights and you'll be able to stop this. You'll establish a new deal for tenants. That applause is for all of you because, conference, it's your work delivering our best ever election result, which has given us the chance to set a historic wrong to rights. Margaret Thatcher got rid of rent controls. We'll be bringing them back. We are on a journey, though, because, conference, although we've been talking for decades about a just transition, about equality and human rights, and about a well-being economy, the rest of the country is now catching up. The extraordinary challenges of the last 18 months have shone a light on a broken economy and a failed social fabric, all while the climate crisis has become more and more visible. The frustration that we feel at the lack of past progress on those things can now be channeled into action. On the streets and the doorsteps, our work creates an urgent call for change, just as we've always done for nearly 50 years of our movement's history, 30 of our own party's history. In Parliament, we're bringing constructive challenge into politics and providing a voice for the communities we represent, just as we've done since 1999. And now, in government, we're now turning rhetoric into action. Now more than ever, thanks to the hard work of our members and campaigners, the Scottish Greens are working for Scotland. And now more than ever, Scotland needs us. It's the most disadvantaged people in our communities who felt the impact of the pandemic most keenly. And that's why we're putting inequality at the heart of the recovery strategy. Only this week there were major announcements that show Green leadership. First, as Lorna mentioned, this week workers in social care got a pay rise, a key part of the cooperation deal. It takes them above the living wage and matches for the first time the pay of people working in the NHS. Throughout the pandemic, we have championed higher pay in this sector because these workers have been on the front line and deserve to be valued. We made it a shared priority, made quick progress, but make no mistake, this is just the first step toward giving care work the value it deserves. Because we must. Because we must, as a society, recognise those who really contribute to our collective well-being. We have to build a recovery that leaves no one behind. The policy programme that we've secured will last throughout this term of Parliament. Some of it will be delivered quickly, and some will take longer. But both Lorna and I have already been extremely busy working on our priorities, and we've already made progress. For example, this week, as Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, I announced the first allocations of at least £1.8 billion of investment toward funding the energy transformation that we need. We're doubling the funding for upgrading public sector buildings like hospitals and schools to £200 million, lowering their carbon footprint. And we're also doubling the funding for upgrading social housing to £200 million as well, making it warmer and cheaper to run, like the tower blocks that I visited in Springburn this week, where banks of heat pumps now give warmth and a 60% cut in bills to hundreds of households. This support for people to switch from expensive gas boilers to sustainable alternatives could not be more urgent at a time when the spike in fossil fuel prices will be pushing more and more people into fuel poverty. It's clear this is an investment our whole society must make. And it's an and it's an investment as well that's going to create 16,400 jobs by the end of this decade alone, and will make a difference in every community right across Scotland. From energy efficiency to heat pumps to district heating, these will cut fuel poverty and Scotland's climate emissions. And a national public energy agency will provide leadership and can harness the potential of scaled-up programmes to decarbonise heat, including helping communities and local government to increase public ownership in our energy system. Conference, I know that you will be impatient for change. You understand the urgency, and so do I. We're only just getting started. As Lorna described, we've got so much more coming to create jobs, progress equality, and to restore and protect our environment in the years to come. Our shared programme in government is about creating a green recovery from the pandemic that tackles the climate and nature emergency. So as well as action on warm homes, we're also going to be transforming Scotland's transport systems. We'll step up the electrification of the network, helped by the £5 billion of investment that we'll deliver for Scotland's railways. And ScotRail itself is coming back into public ownership just in time for our Fair Fares review, which will set out how we can most effectively cut the cost of public transport across the country. Of course, that's something that we started even before we were in government. From January, young people will be able to travel on the bus for free thanks to the work the Scottish Greens did in the last session. And as we shift transport policy away from the private car, our transformational uplift in funding for walking, wheeling and cycling will make a real difference too. Scotland has seen a depressing return to traffic congestion and pollution as people get back to work. But we can tackle this by cutting the need for travel with 20-minute neighbourhoods, making sure public transport is available, reliable and affordable everywhere, and making walking and cycling the safe and easy choice for everyone. And we're going to do just that. In government, the Scottish Greens will be shifting investment away from building ever more space for cars and instead achieving a huge increase in active travel infrastructure. And that ambition doesn't only apply to cities either. In my first month in the job, I had the pleasure of opening the new Bowline active travel project at Bowling Harbour in Western Bartonshire. Its completion not only means that walking, wheeling and cycling on the Glasgow to Loch Lomond route will be protected from a busy road, the community will also see social and economic benefit from putting a piece of neglected built heritage back to good use. We can deliver so many more of these transformational projects, and that's why we've committed to investing at least £320 million, or 10% of the total annual transport budget, on active travel by 24-25. That's almost triple what it is today. Conference, we are working hard for Scotland right now, but we've got big ambitions for Scotland's future too. A Scotland that doesn't just tackle the climate crisis, but leads international efforts for peace and climate justice. As COP26 focuses the world on the climate emergency, we must increase support for the global south and the most vulnerable communities in their efforts to tackle the impacts they're already feeling. That's why Scotland's Climate Justice Fund will increase to £6 million a year, providing £24 million across this Parliament. Let's not pretend that's enough. Greens have always been clear that the argument for independence is about Scotland playing a more positive role in the world. Instead, at the moment, we're forced to spend our energies dealing with a UK government that's desperate to look inwards, savagely cutting international development funding, ignoring climate science, and undermining Scotland's Parliament. We look at the empty supermarket shelves delivered by Brexit, the people struggling to make ends meet after the biggest benefit cut since the creation of the welfare state. We look at the threat to rip up devolution so the Tories can tarmac over Scotland with road building plans and stick a union flag on it. We look at a government using the courts to prevent the Scottish Parliament from upholding the rights of children. And we look at a Prime Minister who says, never mind lowering life expectancy or cancer outcomes, because he's totally, mindlessly devoted to his own shameless self-interest above everything, above lives, above the planet. Conference, we look at these horrors and we know we must defend our homes from these extremists. Whether our... And that's true whether our home means our planet, our country, or the roof over their heads. There's hardly anything more important than home. And Conference, as I said at the start, I know what it's like to be thrown out of your home. Throughout the pandemic, we have pushed for protections for those who faced that. We know that far too many people are still living in rented homes that are insecure, inexpensive, and do not meet their needs. That's why it means so much to me to be able to deliver a new deal for tenants in government. That process starts by speaking to the people who are struggling to pay their rent now. I'll be working with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on this, hearing directly from tenants on low incomes to help shape our rented sector strategy. I've already started speaking to organisations like Living Rent to hear about their experience of insecure housing and how they've organised against abusive landlords. The Greens know that homes are more than bricks and mortar. Decent housing is a human right, and it's critical to our health, our well-being and our life chances. So in government, the Scottish Greens will ensure that tenants' voices are at the heart of our work to ensure that everyone has better, safer and fairer housing. My younger self wouldn't have believed it. If I could go back in time, it would be amazing. If we could go back to the 80s or 90s, we could make the world listen to the warnings of the Green movement. If we did that, the changes that the world needs to make could have been done more slowly and far more easily. But time travel's the stuff of science fiction. We are faced with the here and now. And in this moment, we have a short window of opportunity to make the changes that have been put off for far too long. Those changes must be fair, but they must also be fast as the science demands. If we want a chance of a decent future, the Greens are exactly where we need to be, in government, building a sustainable, greener, fairer future together. So, Conference, our journey has only just begun. Thank you very much. Great to see you all. Great to see you.
Thank you very much.
Conference, I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Chloe Swarbrick is the Green MP for Auckland Central in New Zealand. Chloe is one of the youngest MPs ever elected to New Zealand's Parliament. She's a leader in the movements for drug decriminalisation and tenants' rights, and we are delighted to hear from her this morning.
Kia ora te whānau, hello to my Scottish Green family on the other side of the world. My name is Chloe Swarbrick and I am a Green Party Member of Parliament here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Not that you would necessarily be able to tell it from my surrounds. I am beaming to you, or not quite beaming to you live. I am pre-recording this address for your conference from my apartment in central Auckland, the constituency that I'm privileged to represent. We're currently in lockdown here in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, our largest city. And I want to acknowledge the context that we're coming to this kōrero, this conversation today, which is, of course, the global backdrop of a global pandemic of COVID-19. I want to acknowledge those who have experienced devastation and loss as a result. I also want to acknowledge that for many of us, particularly those of around my age, it's the first time in our lives, and for everybody else, almost definitely the first time in living history, that we have seen governments react. We have seen systems and structures stood up and put in place in a way that we have been told for so long was impossible. At a really local level here in Aotearoa, it was providing housing for those who were on the streets. It was flexible working arrangements, which single parents and people with disabilities have been asking for a really long time. It was increasing the incomes of our lowest paid New Zealanders. All of these things happened virtually overnight. All of these things that we were told for so long were politically or economically impossible. And obviously what that did is expose that all of these issues were always a matter of political willpower. We've got the solutions, we can solve them. We just need the right people in decision-making powers who are held to account by those outside of power to make it happen. And that's what makes me really excited about being a Green. I think that there is no other political party, at least here in Aotearoa, and I don't want to cast aspersions on what's happening over in Scotland, but no other political party that has that commitment to systemic change so deeply embedded in its DNA. For us here, as I'm sure it is for you, it's reflected in our charter. Our charter for the Green Party of Aotearoa in New Zealand is those 4 core charter principles, or PO, and all of that sits on a backdrop of a commitment to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the indigenous version of the text of the Treaty of Waitangi. That is a commitment to indigenous leadership and solutions. That filters through all of those charter principles, which I think it's really important to regularly remind ourselves of. So I'm going to run you through them really quickly. But first and foremost, ecological wisdom, recognition of the fact that resources are finite, and those that do regenerate, God forbid, give them some time and space and planning to regenerate, because otherwise we exhaust them. If you accept that as a really logical premise to human life on Earth, the next one makes a whole lot of sense. Social responsibility, as derogatorily termed social justice by our friends on the internet. That is, if resources are relatively finite, then we need to ensure that they are distributed in a just way, that everybody has access to not only the basics to survive, but what is necessary to help them flourish. Thirdly, appropriate decision-making. Devolve those decision-making powers down to the level where it actually affects people. Move away from centralization that does not service those who are not close to power. Fourthly, and obviously deeply interconnected to all of this stuff because we're Greens and we're hippies, non-violence. We don't like going to war. But I think more than that, it's about bringing together a diverse group of people, people from all walks of life, all life experiences, from the get-go, around the decision-making table when you're designing systems and solutions, so that they actually do work for everybody, so that you don't end up neglecting a perspective that further down the track is going to pop its head up and say, hey, this sucks and it doesn't work for me. Outlined there in our charter is how we change and transform systems. If we applied that to our parliamentary system, how radically different would it look? But with all of that aside, reflecting on your really awesome new circumstances, congratulations for your situation with government. It presents some really, really awesome opportunities, but also some really important risks, some really important challenges to who we are as Greens and how we operate inside of institutions that we fundamentally kind of dislike. And that tension's important to name, and it's important to consistently work through. That tension is, how do you remain accountable to the grassroots communities, the activists and the organisers who put you into that place, whilst also upholding things like, for us, cabinet confidentiality, those private discussions that happen behind the scenes where you have to work through and make trade-offs on some really impossible things. I often think about how so much of what we do as Greens is harm minimisation and the absence of the transformation that we all so keenly want and work for. That is to make sure that we don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, or that we don't pass up an opportunity to improve things somewhat whilst figuring out how to retain a commitment to our aspirations, the transformation that we know is necessary to not only meet the challenges of our time, but to ensure that everybody thrives moving forward. And that's a hard one. And you're only going to be able to do it, and we were only able to do it through constant, difficult conversations around the caucus table in parliaments, but also with our grassroots membership, particularly as a minority in parliament, let alone a minority in government. To give you some context for what we were dealing with, we were 8 members of parliament working with 2 other political parties in a parliament of 120. You need 61 votes to pass any piece of legislation, to pass any budget. We were working with the Labour Party, which is actually not all too dissimilar from the situation of the Labour Party in the UK, and a party known as New Zealand First, and you can derive exactly what they care about in their name, which kind of shows you that we were dealing with 3 different parties with very different priorities, very different communities of interest, very different commitments to what the future should look like, and the changes or trade-offs that they were willing to make. And that is why we are stoked with the things that we managed to get through with the institution of the Zero Carbon Act, changes to the emissions trading scheme, which means that we'll be the first country in the world to put a price on agricultural emissions, things like climate financing and transparency on climate-related risks for huge corporations in this country, things like increasing the benefits for our most vulnerable New Zealanders, things like rent-to-own schemes, things like, ostensibly, greater police discretion when it comes to the criminalisation of those who are using illicit substances. None of these things were as good as we wanted them to be, but they were steps in the right direction, and we continue to stay committed to that bigger picture, and we continue to campaign for it. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson for us, is that campaigning has to be ongoing. I think as Greens we get that. You can't leave politics to the politicians. You can't pretend that it just happens every 3 or 4 years with a general election. Politics happens every single day. Politics is about decision making. It's about power, it's about wealth, it's about resources. It's about who wins and who loses, who the decision is made for and who the decision impacts. And that's our role in our parliamentary wing, is to try and change those decisions. So how do we change those decisions? Well, I try and conceptualize it as kind of two broad spheres. On the one side of things, you've got the structure, and that's the stuff which all of us are pretty familiar with. It's the blueprint or the coat hooks for how society functions or operates. It's things like legislation, regulation, funding, incentives, subsidies, taxation, contracts, procurement, treaties, all of that. But the stuff that we don't talk about anywhere near enough from my perspective is culture. And culture I'm not using here as ethnic or religious practice. I'm using it from a design thinking perspective, and that is a shared set of values. When you think about culture as a shared set of values, you come to understand how we can have an incredibly diverse society that is peaceful, that shares ideas, because there is baseline and prioritization of a few key things. The way that we go about changing culture, or a few of the touch points off the top of my head, are things like education. That one takes a really long time, and there's a reason that there's been a really fiery debate here in Aotearoa about the teaching of our history, our true history in schools. But we know that kids today learning that are going to be making better decisions in the future because they have a real understanding of the whenua of the land and the history of that land that they stand on. It's also things like media, including social media. And when you think about how that interacts with structure, think, for example, of how reporting on climate has changed substantially in the past just 3 to 5 years. We've gone from a space of media largely providing a false equivalency of, here we have a scientist who can tell you about the laws of physics and how climate change is playing out and going to impact us all. And on the other hand, we have to hold somebody up who's a denier and pretend as though they are par on par. We've seen that shift and change, and that has had an influence on structures and the structures that people anticipate and expect from their politicians. It's meant that there is a greater prioritization of more value put on climate action. But as we know, there is a real serious and important fear, a risk that so much of the rhetoric becomes just that, and that we end up in quite an Orwellian space where everybody's talking about it, but they're not really doing it. And that's the importance of consistent engagement in politics, not just by the politicians. And we'll get back to that soon. Another one of those really key points, or ways of trying to shift culture or bring about more awareness or realign those values, and I think it's the one that we don't talk about anywhere near enough, is community building or collective action. And it's kind of what we do when we build campaigns for elections. But I think that we have a real challenge and a really important task ahead of us to do that outside of elections. We have to do it beyond the 3 to 4 year cycle. We have to do it beyond the one kind of bang event of everybody marching down the street. We have to have sustained effort on decision makers and the powers that be. I apologize, that is my cat meowing locked outside of the office. We have to do that through bringing together a group of people who really solidly care about something and focusing on growing that group. Because if we don't do that, then we never will grow the green movement. And the green movement, interestingly, is in a point of important reflection on our identity. Because everyone wants to be us right now. Everyone has a climate policy. Everyone is now largely in agreement that climate change exists. And this is the Orwellian fear that I was referring to or alluding to before. We need to be very, very, very aware that we have a role to continue to push for transformative action. That we don't just end up with greenwashed late capitalism and all of the despair and misery that comes with that. You know, I think about how Jeanette Fitzsimons, our founding female co-leader of the Greens in Aotearoa, said that we have an economic system that exploits both people and the planet. And I think as Greens, I hope as Greens, all of us are committed to radical transformation of that system, one that is truly aligned with the idea of the just transition as it was first conceived of by Indigenous climate activists and the unions. It's not just the greenwashing of our vehicle fleets. It is, in fact, redistribution of power and of wealth. And when we do that, when we think about doing that, we move away from what is currently a system that is going to see those who are on the front lines, those who live in the Pacific Islands, who are contributing the least in terms of climate changing emissions, but going to be the first and the worst impacted by climate change. Whereas those who right now are contributing the most have the resources to continue moving further and further away from the impact that they're having on the planet. We start to realign that system. And that is fundamental to who we are as Greens. So we go about achieving that by community building, by consistently prioritizing what it is that we care about. And I genuinely believe that we can do that with one foot inside of that decision-making realm, but we have to pay far more attention to what's happening on the ground, because otherwise we lose sight of it in the almost literal embodiment of the ivory tower. So I hope that that's been somewhat useful or insightful or otherwise a good soaking up of approximately 16 minutes. I just finally, I guess, want to underline all of this by saying that the easiest way to bring all of those kind of bits and pieces together is to remind our broader movement not to leave politics to the politicians. It's awesome to get people elected, and we should celebrate that. It is awesome to be in a position where we influence government decision making. But while we don't hold the majority, while we aren't able to implement our entire vision, we have to consistently remain committed to movement building, or we end up perversely minimizing our power to force through those changes. So as Glasgow, COP lands on your doorstep at Glasgow in the next month or so, you have the opportunity to put the world's spotlight on exactly those issues. And James Shaw, our Minister for Climate Change, our co-leader of the Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand, will be heading over. And I hope that, well, I know that he will be doing the same for us. But he, of course, represents our government as well as the Greens here. And that comes with those tensions, which is really necessary to underscore, to make explicit, to remember that, you know, we'll continue pushing as far as we possibly can, but that the remit from the government is perhaps nowhere near as ambitious as we as Greens in our heart of heart want. So how do we continue to put that front and centre? We continue to mobilise, we continue to organise, and we don't let climate action, we don't let school strikes for climate be a flash in the pan. We continue to remind everyday people of their power. Anyway, whānau, I hope that that's been something. And I hope to catch you all in the not too distant future. Please have a lovely rest of your conference. You've got this. You've got this. When you remember that all of the problems that face us, whether it's rubbish floating the size of a small island in the Pacific Ocean, the climate crises, folks sleeping rough out the front of Gucci or Louis Vuitton luxury stores, when you realize that all of that stuff isn't inevitable, when you realize that it is the consequences of decision making by people in power, by successive governments, when you realize that, it can be quite disheartening, but it also is, I believe, incredibly empowering, because it reminds you of the responsibility of those who are making decisions today and how different decisions can be made. It's incredibly radical to dream of a better future, but it's even more radical to organise and to mobilise for it. So, all the best, kia kaha. All the best, kia kaha.
Thank you again so much to Chloe for sending that address over. Conference, you now have a tea break. Tea and coffee is up the stairs. You should all be back down here for the first fringe. Please be back down for 25